Welcome everyone to the RAI Goes to the Movies, our film discussion series, which this term puts people from the world of film in conversation with academics to discuss important movies by African-American filmmakers. I'm Sage, the Esmond Harmsworth Graduate Culture Scholar here at Oxford's Rothermere American Institute, the convener of this series and your chair for the discussion. Today we're talking about Daughters of the Dust, Julie Dash's independent film from 1991, which was the first film directed by a Black woman to achieve widespread release in American theaters. It doesn't tell a story in the conventional sense, but through its luscious vignettes, it's at once a history of African-American South Sea Islanders and a love poem dedicated to Gullah culture. More recently, it was the inspiration behind Beyonce's visual album Lemonade. We're lucky to be joined today by scholars Dr. Melissa Cooper and Alexandria Smith, as well as filmmaker Winter Dunn, who will offer us their insights on the film and its history before we open out into discussion. But first, let me introduce them properly. First, we have Dr. Cooper. Dr. Melissa Cooper is a writer, historian, and professor. She is the author of the groundbreaking historical study, Making Gullah, a history of Sapelo Islanders, race, and the American imagination. Dr. Cooper's book captured popular attention and was reviewed in a variety of media, ranging from the New Yorker to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and a host of podcasts and radio shows. She is currently Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University, Newark, and is also a 2021 Scholar in Residence at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Amongst her other publications, Dr. Cooper recently co-authored the article, The Saviors of Gullah Identity, Teaching Daughters of the Dust and the Classics of Black Women Writers. Next, I'm pleased to announce Alexandria Smith. Alexandra is a PhD candidate in Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, also at Rutgers New Brunswick campus. Her research explores questions of sensation, embodiment, eroticism, and geography in literatures written by diasporic Black queer subjects. Her dissertation, Aphrodite's Room, Mapping the Shape of Space and Narrative in Black queer women's writing, proposes sensual world-making as a literary strategy which employs lived and embodied experiences as a source of literary and theoretical knowledge about gender, Blackness, and queerness. Her writing has appeared in the New Inquiry, and her essay on Michelle Cliff's memoir is forthcoming in an edited collection published by Lexington Books. And finally, I'm thrilled to introduce Winter Dunn. Winter is an award-winning filmmaker with a passion for depicting rich Black stories. She produced Numa Perrier's debut feature film Jezebel, which premiered at South by Southwest 2019 and was awarded Best Narrative Feature at the American Black Film Festival that same year. Jezebel has been acquired by Ava DuVernay and is currently streaming on Netflix. Winter most recently directed the documentary series All Her with Angela Rye for Quibi. Her debut short film Junebug is currently in its 2021 festival season. Winter is also the CEO of Winter Dunn Productions, a full-service multimedia production house based in LA. As an actress, she can be seen on screen in several shorts, web series, and television series, including credits on Netflix's Drug Lords, Issa Rae's Insecure, plus digital programs with Fuse, BuzzFeed, and Nylon. So let's begin, please, by hearing from Dr. Melissa Cooper.
Hi, good evening, and thank you so much, Sage Goodwin and University of Oxford's Rothermere American Institute for inviting me to participate in this exciting conversation with Alexandria and Winter and our audience. Julie Dash's groundbreaking and historic film, Daughters of the Dust, should surely be counted among the most influential African-American works of art. While the film offers so much for its audiences to reflect on, and there's so many ways that scholars and theorists can engage with the film, as a historian who studies the world of ideas and meaning, I'd like to focus my introductory comments on the way that Dash, through Daughters of the Dust, intervened in and disrupted a long history of imagining Gullah folk, the Black residents of coastal districts in the South Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry. For generations, collectors and writers, scholars and artists, they've nurtured a fascination with the folk culture of the descendants of the Africans who were enslaved in the Lowcountry. And this fascination centered on the possibility that among these populations, real evidence of the retention of African cultural traditions, material traditions, spiritual practices, and a distinct dialect had survived chattel slavery. And as a result, the stories and theories about Lowcountry Blacks' folk culture they have at different moments and for a variety of reasons taken center stage in the larger imaginary. In my book, Making Gullah, I trace across the landscape of time the ways that stories about the Gullah and Gullah folk culture have evolved and how these stories have emerged in relation to shifting ideas about race and racial inheritance. And in the 1920s and 30s, the period that I refer to as the Gullah explosion, I found researchers and writers influenced by a host of ideas that include new theories about race and culture and retentions emerging in the academy, a popular obsession with African spiritual primitivism, the Harlem Renaissance, and its dependence on ideas about Black authenticity, and both a curiosity about and backlash against the Black Southern migrants who changed the nation's racial geography. And all of these influences together encouraged a renewed exploration of Black Southern culture. And the researchers and collectors who studied Gullah folk and published books and articles about them and wrote about them, their imaginings of the Gullah were shaped by these influences. And within the 20s and 30s, Hayes, coastal Georgia's and South Carolina's Black people's basket weaving and fishnet making and storytelling, their spiritual rituals, and their dialect took on a new hue and significance. But most of the white writers and researchers inspired by the vogue of Southern Black folk life during the 20s and 30s, they depicted Gullah folk as backward and superstitious racial oddities. Um, and published works like the Savannah Unit's Federal Writers Project study Drums and Shadows, and Lydia Parrish's Slave Songs of the Georgia Sea Islands, and Julia Peterkin's Pulitzer Prize winning Gullah fiction tended to reduce African survivals in the region to a quaint local color, a gift given to the region by African primitives. And to some extent, this is not surprising, given the fact that Black people's African ancestry was the assumed root of their supposed inferiority. But in the wake of the Black Studies movement in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, there was yet another shift in ideas about race and racial inheritance. African survivals and the importance and significance of the Black past again took on a new hue. And this is the moment when we find Black women writers and other scholars and intellectuals returning to the 1920s and 30s publications and other material from the Gullah explosion of the interwar years to find new meaning for Low Country Black folk culture. And we can see this in Pauli Marshall's Praise Song for the Widow, Gloria Naylor's novel Mama Day, and Anne Dash's Daughters of the Dust. And so the Gullah, as first described by folklorists in search of authentic elements of African culture in America, represented an exotic, ignorant, primitive, vanishing Negro type doomed to extinction. Yet when these Black women writers mine 1920s and 30s Gullah studies, sifting through the intellectual debris of a charged moment in America's race-making history, their imaginations were ignited and new formulations of Gullah folk surfaced in their fictional works. And we can literally see how Dash remade the Gullah in her film. She elevates root work and related spiritual conceptualizations, portraying them as so much more than mental antiques. And in doing so, she centers Black women at the intersections of spiritual power. She also reimagined Sapelo Island's famous ancestor Bilali Muhammad, a man enslaved on Sapelo who had been the subject of stories even before the Gullah explosion because he left behind a diary written in ancient Arabic. She reimagines Bilali Muhammad through her character Bilal and elevates the significance of his spiritual practice too. So Dash's Gullah story, together with the other Gullah stories that Black women writers penned during the period, revises the African survivals concept and transforms African survivals into practices and ideas that ensured Black peoples and Black families' literal survival and tethers even the unborn to a lineage of power and resilience and beauty. So, looking forward to talking more about this with you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. That's such fascinating context to put the movie into. We're going to pass over now to Alexandria.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Cooper, for that historical context. And I want to thank Sage, Tangela, my fellow panelists, the RAI for hosting us, and the audience for tuning in. In my initial notes about the film, I remarked on how Daughters of the Dust draws our attention to place, from the level of the body to the level of transnational and transoceanic diasporas. And I think this attention to place is worth emphasizing here today. Daughters of the Dust accomplishes two unusual and remarkable feats. It tells a story which situates African Americans within the broader context of the African diaspora, and it simultaneously illustrates the United States as a place which contains multiple and varied diasporic legacies itself. While the film's setting is contained in the small island location of Igbo Landing, the dialogues and gestures of the characters weave in Nigeria and Equatorial Guinea, the ancestral home of the Igbo people, Cuba, the French West Indies, Savannah, Georgia, and Philadelphia. And I suggest that these far-reaching locations are not only references to elsewhere posed against the here of Igbo Landing, but instead that these diverse locations are integral to the Pazant family as a diasporic community. Nana Pazant, the source and keeper of the family's legacy, tells Eli that the ancestors and the womb are one and the same. She repeatedly states that we, meaning herself and her generations of descendants, are the last of the old and the first of the new. Eula, pregnant with who will become a new generation of Pazants, reminds her family that they are the daughters of the dusty things Nana keeps in her old tin. We can therefore understand geography, ancestry and reproduction, and dust itself as three theorizations of diasporic continuity within this film. So how is it that geography comes to characterize the diasporic reach of a family who appears to be stuck in one small place? It begins with the name. The island where the family is situated bears many names, as we learn from St. Julian as he narrates his letter to Iona. Yet the name that sticks, at least for the Pazant family, is Igbo Landing. This marginalized island off the eastern coast of what has become the United States is thus forever marked with a West African presence. Similarly, Bilal's arrival to Igbo Landing as a child from the French West Indies reminds us that the movements of the transatlantic slave trade were not simple nor unidirectional. As the Pazants moved through other spaces in the Americas, whether elsewhere in the United States or through Caribbean islands, they move as Black people in a broad and diasporic sense, and Black people whose experiences of Blackness are shaped by their particular diasporic heritage. The ancestors and the womb are one and the same, as Nana Pazant said. This statement positions the living, both those we follow in this film and perhaps ourselves as well, as occupying only one position within life's continuous flow. Nana's insistence on the importance of remaining attuned to the ancestors through practices of memory and recollection is matched by the film's attention to the unborn child. We see this child as a kind of specter, running among the family as a presence who is felt, and yet who is only seen as a fleeting image. Within the context of diaspora, the continuity between the ancestors and the womb means that the unborn child and the new generations she represents carry essential elements of the ancestors within them. With each generation arrives changes which reflect the changing world, of course, yet this continuity, linked through the thread of the living, means that the places, the language, and the knowledge of the ancestors continues to live in some form in the new generations. And it's fitting then that dust is the titular metaphor of this film. Dust is deceptive in the sense that it contains much more than its form suggests. Dust often seems like refuse or trash, Yet sometimes we may collect or carry dust from a site that is meaningful to us. There are forms of dust which carry great symbolic or economic value, such as gold dust or the dust-like ash of cremated relatives. Dust is fine, which means that it can travel easily and far. And I'm thinking of Kamal Brathwaite's reference, I think in his long poem, The Arrivants, of dust from windy seasons in West Africa arriving on Caribbean islands after being carried on the wind across the Atlantic Ocean. Dust is residue, meaning that its existence points to the trace of something that was once present. When Eula asserts that she and her sisters are the daughters of the dusty things that Nana carries, I think she invokes each of these meanings of dust. They have traveled, though not easily, across the sea to a site that has become their home. And most significantly, they are the physical continuation of the lives which their ancestors clung to. Thank you all, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Alexandria. That was really beautiful. We'll pass now over to Winter.
Hello, hi. First off, I just want to say thank you so much for having me here. This is going to be a really exciting conversation, and I am so enjoying hearing the historical context that the film is kind of placed in and born from. And as a filmmaker, Daughters of the Dust is required viewing, especially as a Black filmmaker. It is required viewing. Julie Dash and the community that she was a part of, they were known as the LA Rebellion. And it was a group of filmmakers trained out of UCLA, I would say, through the late 60s, throughout early 80s. And so a major point of this collective was to make Black film by people of color that actively went against films in the Hollywood canon that we had seen before its time. And so Julie Dash wanted to make a film, or she did make a film, that didn't fit in mainstream Hollywood culture, but it actually disrupted it and created something new and a new form of storytelling that we've seen after, right? Looking at Beyonce's Lemonade, looking at the visuals, Burial of Kojo, currently streaming on Netflix, you can see the ties to, the inspiration from films that are currently being made. And so disrupting that Hollywood form of storytelling, I like to say Julie Dash used every tool in her toolbox to do that, right? Starting off with just the way the film is written and the writing style of the film, right? Most films up to this point, they follow what I like a male story structure arc, right? You have an inciting incident. That's when our character decides to fight for whatever it is that they want in the story. The conflict builds, they fight for what they want, and it leads to a climax, falling action, and then we have some sort of resolution. That's typically the arc or the story structure that we were accustomed to seeing. And Julie Dash wrote her film in a circular story structure. So pieces of the film unfold, and it doesn't, what happened before and what's happening now, that this moment doesn't always build upon the last. It doesn't follow a linear time structure, because the plot, while it's important and the specific time that the film takes place is important, it's not the full film in itself. It's not a historical drama that we were used to seeing. It actually follows, it feels like folklore, right? The film presents itself to audiences in the same way the Gullah people would tell stories amongst their family. So it's like, as an audience member, we're immersed into the culture and the storytelling of these people, just in the way we're digesting information and the way Julie Dash and her cinematographer present information to the audience. So writing structure, I love the way she tells this story and the way she writes the story, but just talking about the visual, right? This is the first film directed by a Black woman to get wide distribution. And I like to think Black women, we have always had an interesting perspective of a story that we feel like we know, we've seen a million times. A woman can come in and offer a fresh perspective that we hadn't seen to that point. And you see that in the visual storytelling. I mean, she shoots in a way that it's poetic. The image itself is telling story the same way the language is telling story, right? You will never forget the images of these women, dark-skinned Black women with natural hairstyles dancing on the beach in these ivory or like white cream dresses with the boots. It's so iconic, right? It's so specific and beautifully done. Even with the way we see the unborn child, who is our narrator through the film, she uses I'm gonna find, I have it in my notes, but she uses a technique that like breaks up the timing of the footage. So it actually feels like there's an energy here that's not literal. This is a body, this is a person that's not physically in the space, but she's just as alive and just as present as the folks who are currently alive. The same way she's bringing and evoking the energy of the ancestors. They're just as alive as the people currently living. And so, oh, I could go on and on. Sorry, I'm not a professor, so I'm speaking from the heart, but it really is fantastic. And there's so many visual storytelling beats throughout this film, even the use of trees and the use of placing bodies in trees in this film, especially looking at, you know, what we would assume historically when we say Black bodies in trees in America, right? We all have a very visceral image that pops in our mind. And Julie Dash is completely working against what we would expect. And she places bodies in these beautiful frames in these big trees. And it feels like, wow, these women are connected to something bigger than them, and they're connected to something that was rooted before they were born. And Nana says a line at the end of the film, you know, she says, "You're fruit from an ancient tree." And it's beautiful that that line is at the end of the film, because she's using that line visually throughout the entire piece. You see it, you see that these women, these people are fruit, and she's quite literally placing them in the trees as such. So we can talk all day. I am so excited to dive in and to have you beautiful ladies with me. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Winter. That was that was super interesting. So I'm gonna invite our three speakers to have a chance to discuss amongst themselves for us thoughts that each of the talks have inspired. At the same time, I'm going to ask the audience to please have a think about what questions you want to ask, because once we've had a chance for the three speakers to discuss between themselves, I'll open it out for audience questions. You're welcome to put those into the chat and I can ask them for you, or raise your hand function, or you can put in the chat that you want to ask a question. But we'll start with our three speakers. Feel free to jump in, anyone that has a question for the other speakers or a comment, or just wants to say more that they've been inspired by what the others have said. Go ahead.
I have two questions. This was wonderful, and I love the range of perspectives. I think getting both the historicization from Dr. Cooper and the technical and like the visual aspects from Winter is extremely useful for me. And so I think my questions for the two of you want to continue that a bit. Dr. Cooper, I'm curious to hear, I have two questions, one of which I'm less attached to. When you were talking about, it seems like you're talking about the way that this film revises the approaches, both by white scholars and even by some Black scholars, of the way that the Gullah are presented. And I'm curious to, I guess, to hear what you think about the kind of absent presence of whiteness within the film. There aren't any white people in the film, but their presence is there. And I think maybe more importantly than that, I'm interested in, I guess, how do you think the film, are there any ways that it explicitly revises the kinds of narratives that are imposed on the Gullah? And I think my question to Winter is kind of similar. And I think in a way you've answered my question, but I'd love to hear you expand on it. What would you say is the most significant visual lesson of the film? And again, I do think you've talked about how these visuals have carried forth into other Black cinema. But what would you say is the most important visual lesson or takeaway from Daughters of the Dust?
Well, I guess I'll just jump in. I would say the poetic use of visual is something that I hadn't really seen in Black film. And it's after revisiting the film for this discussion, I'm going to go back and watch more Black cinema from the 80s, watch more Black cinema from the 70s to see if it did exist before and I just wasn't aware. But it's something really special about the way that Julie places images in front of us. It mirrors the poetic language and the poetic form of storytelling in the writing, right? And so when we see the Black women on the beach dancing, at first it just feels literal, right? It's a very literal image. They're on the beach, you can see that, you understand what you think is story. And then as we start to dive into this aspect of the ancestors and evoking them and asking them questions and looking for protection for them, all of a sudden the image starts to change. We're in this big wide, right? She loves to use her location, loves to use the location as a story, as a character in the story. So she's oftentimes putting her camera way back. You see the trees, you see the water, you see the bodies, you see the dress. And as we start to talk about ancestors and as it starts to feel more spiritual and you hear that sound and you're like, okay, it's more than what I thought. We start diving into tight shots of the women in the flow of the dresses and the slow movement, and it starts to feel like a dance in itself, more than just, oh, bodies dancing on a beach. There's something more happening underneath the physical presence of just women on a beach. And what she said they used a speed control computer. That's what they called it. So they're actually using the frame and they're slowing down tempo in a really specific way. So the like I said, the visual becomes a agent of storytelling, right? Just like the language and just like the poetry in the language does.
Wow. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Alexandria, you gave me a lot there in the questions, and I'll try to be brief because I know that we want to have a conversation with our audience, but there are a couple of things that I think is important to know about the revision. So the stories that really began to circulate in the 20s and 30s about Gullah folk, they were written in the frame of both fact and fiction. You know, you have your Julia Peterkins writing fictional tales, and then you have the researchers and writers and collectors trying to document Gullah folk culture. But what's interesting about the ways that they did it was that they brought a whole world of assumptions about race and racial inheritance with them. And in so doing, when they went to describe in a quasi-anthropological fashion Gullah folk culture and went to study communities, they generally ignored Jim Crow. They generally ignored the racial power structure. So what resulted in the publications is that you get a picture of Black communities in the Low Country, on islands, and maybe in the mainland, who were insular, isolated, and somehow detached from those realities. And that was anything but the case. So, you know, for people who lived on Sapelo, there was a succession of folks who assumed, literally took up station in the grounds of what used to be the big house, Howard Coffin and R.J. Reynolds, and there was a quasi, you know, some might call it quasi plantation state that returned to the island. And so the power structures of Jim Crow were there, but the researchers and writers weren't interested in that. They were trying to find African survivals, and they were trying to document this culture. And so when Black women writers go back and mine these materials, they are getting a picture of these communities that is sort of, is outside to a certain extent of the Jim Crow power dynamics. So I'm not surprised when you read, you know, some of the fictional works, you know, Polly Marshall's Praise Song for the Widow or Mama Day, that whites are very much not central in the story. And that's for a couple of reasons. They're intentionally not centering them, but also the literature that they're pulling from to rediscover this folklore doesn't either, right? So I think that's an important observation to make about the absence, right? These writers are returning to literature which has created the absence of these dynamics. With regard to explicit revisions, I mean, at the time that Black women writers are rediscovering the folk and taking a look at Gullah Geechee folk culture and communities, scholars in other disciplines, historians, anthropologists, so everyone's taking a second look in the wake of the Black Studies movement.
Sure.
So they are collectively together looking back at these imperfect sources and trying to figure out what could be pulled and extracted from them now that we have a better understanding of, African cultures, West African history, etc. So this artistic contribution, I would say, does less in the academy, but does more for low country Black folk who are learning in the wake of the Black Studies movement to embrace, right, the idea of this cultural uniqueness and this, cultural uniqueness, which had largely been tied with in the imagination of a lot of the white writers and collectors, had been tied to an idea of backwardness. If you talk to people who are old enough from the Low Country, they'll tell you there was a time where being called Geechee was an insult. Right? It was an insult. So when you have Black women writers and you have all of the new ideas and information that are sort of formulated during the Black Studies movement, presenting a new view, right, alongside of a new assertion of race pride, right, that comes back again. It's there in the 20s and 30s too, but it certainly gets caught up in the primitivism. The Harlem Renaissance literati who really were interested in recovering Black history and Black stories and Black folk culture, they have to contend with an exoticism that makes it very hard to do so in productive ways that potentially liberate Black people. But in the wake of the Black Studies movement, the push is different. And so when you have works like these, the novels and films like Daughters of the Dust, low country Blacks get to imagine themselves outside of the gaze of people like Julia Peterkin or Mary Granger in the Savannah Unit, or Lydia Parrish. Now there's a different way to understand their past and their history and their uniqueness, and it's not belittling and it's not condescending and it's not wrapped up in all sorts of ideas about Black inferiority.
And I kind of want to continue on that. Something that stood out to me in the film is that there are these multiple methods of self-authoring narratives. I was struck by at the beginning we see Mr. Sneed, that Viola has hired a photographer to document this big occasion for her family. And so even though she herself is not the one taking the photos, I think it's really significant that photography, and in 1902, is not cheap, is not easy, is not very accessible, but is a way that Viola is deciding, I want there to be a story told about this moment for my family. And I think similarly, the unborn child is, not literally documenting, not writing, but is the one narrating to us, both on behalf of herself and on behalf of her family in a larger sense. So I think in that way, within the film itself, Dash is centering, this is about stories being told, and this is about making decisions, women and girls making decisions about how stories are being told.
Absolutely.
I love that women are deciding how stories are being told. And I too, watching the film, I loved watching the elders teaching the kids the language. And I love, there's one line, she's like, that's all grandma remembers. But there's like a pride in the oral tradition of like, we have to pass down our language. We have to pass down our stories. Otherwise, they no longer exist, right? And we're doing a disservice to all the pain and all the joy and all the culture that has brought us up to this point. And I love what you said about Viola bringing a photographer in to document her own history and to be the author in some sort of her history and of her own story, because it's like, that's how she was born, that's how she was bred, that was what she was raised to do, even though she's now adopting a Western civilization, Western religions, bringing Christianity and putting a focus on that and saying, hey, this is the way of our future, and I'm going to be I'm going to transport us to the future, quite literally. I'm coming back to grab you and to bring you into what's next. So like, I love that the women are the ones telling story. The women are the ones making sure that the story continues to live throughout the generations of that family. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Cooper or Winter, either of you have any questions?
I don't think I have any questions. I'm just really enjoying hearing just this academic perspective on the film. I've never been in a conversation quite like this one. I'm typically with filmmakers and we're looking at the technique of the storytelling and why we think it's significant, but I love hearing just the context and just coming at it from a different perspective. Dr. Cooper, any questions for us? Any thoughts?
So much, too much. I think that most of what I might want to know would be unveiled in the conversation with our audience. So let's see how that goes.
Audience, does anyone have any questions? Please raise your hand or type them in the chat. Don't be shy. I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions, so please, please ask them if anyone's got them. While everyone's thinking, a question that I had that I think actually I'd be interested to hear all of your perspectives on is about the language, or rather languages, in the film. I'm really interested from a historical perspective as to how accurate that could be, whether those languages are recorded in any kind of spoken way, and then from a production acting perspective, Winter, if you've got any thoughts about, I mean, those actors in the 1990s, how difficult would it have been for them to learn to give convincing performances of I actually don't know anything about the actors that have done that are in it. I don't know if they're from that community or not. And I'd just be quite interested to what your thoughts were on the language and also the role of sort of actors not of the community, if they aren't acting in that. And then also applying to Alexandria, like what you were saying about all of the different places. I've thought it was the way they use language is really interesting with that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So yeah, whoever feels like they have something to say about that, please jump in.
Well, the language is that's an interesting question to raise. You know, Dash did a lot of research from the film in her writings, what she wrote and her reflections about making Daughters of the Dust. So one of the Black researchers to conduct research in the Low Country during the interwar years was Lorenzo Down Turner, who, was an African-American scholar, linguist, who was looking to overturn the baby talk thesis with regard to the Gullah dialect, the idea that any variations in Low Country Blacks' speech was really the product of a sort of ignorance, the inability to grasp English, slave masters having to use a baby talk to communicate with them, etc. So he was looking to really overturn that. And he collected lots of linguistic samples in the research that he did for Africanisms in the Gullah dialect was ultimately the book. So with the Federal Writers Project, there were some recordings as well in the region. So there were opportunities to hear what would have been considered quote unquote authentic dialect. But in Lorenzo Dow Turner's notes, one of the things I wrote about in the book, it was sort of funny to hear him describe folk, in particular, one Sapelo Islander, Katie Brown. He suggested that, she code switched. She changed her speech when she was sitting with him. What he would hear her, how he would hear her talk to people in the community was different than what she did when she knew that she was being studied and recorded. So I would even suggest at that moment, what is quote unquote authentic would be hard to pin down. So I do think that there was an attempt to kind of be true to the way that the dialect is spoken in certain places. But even the research taking you as far back as you can go in terms of listening to recorded speech is produced under some interesting circumstances.
That's great. I love that because I don't have any of that insight currently. I'm going to get your book and I'm going to read it because I'm fascinated. But in terms of the actors in the production, so I know, or from what I've read, Julie Dash came to location with a core team, but what they did, they didn't have a large budget. I think the budget was like $800,000 for the full film, which is not a lot of money in film. So they would find like associate producers or PAs from the region to be a part of the crew, so that they were met with people who had a better understanding of like the land, of like a different cultural relationship, as opposed to one that's only being studied. They have their own history and their family's history to bring to the perspective. In terms of the actors, I don't know if they cast out of the region. They might have. I do know that there was a dialect coach on set working with all the actors, trying to keep it as authentic, as organic as possible. And from an actor's perspective, I mean, working with dialect, working with a language that maybe isn't your own is always tough. So it requires a lot of time, it requires a lot of research, it requires that dialect coach really sitting with you and like helping you own the language, so that then you can make choices and really like use the language, as opposed to sticking to the dialect itself. You got to get past that point and start having agency as an actor and as a character, and start fighting for what you want. Otherwise, we don't move forward in the storytelling. So they definitely had support in that way. I can't speak to any of the actors' specific experiences or some of their specific challenges, but it seemed like Julie Dash, she just had a real understanding of how to create a sense of authenticity. And so she did that in crewing up, in bringing in a dialect coach, in finding people. One of the actresses actually is Geechee and like already spoke the language and was like very familiar. So it's like those little elements, finding people who are already connected, they kind of help you cultivate that sense of authenticity.
Yeah, and the film's credits, give us some hints, right? Emery Campbell from Penn Center was, played a role in helping the production. Vertamae Grosvenor, there are people in the mix who would have been able to at least comment on the direction of some of the dialect. But, the Low Country is an interesting story. Different people in different places and from different states have different ideas about what is authentic, and sort of, how the dialects are similar and or different across, state lines and or other regional distinctions.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Noni. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Sage. Thanks, everyone. This has been really interesting. I was really struck by your conversation about storytelling, and particularly saying that Mr. Sneed is there taking the photo. And I feel like I understand his role in the movie, and I kind of understand Viola's, and I think I understand Yellow Mary's, but I just can't get my head around Trula and what she's doing there, and especially the scene where she runs away when Nana Paysan is speaking to the family. And I would just love to hear your guys' perspective on her place in the movie. Thanks.
I'm glad that you brought that up. Thank you for that question. I guess there were a couple of directions that I, was thinking about in reflecting on the movie. And, I ended up thinking primarily about this diasporic angle, but there is something very interesting with regard to queerness. And, earlier I mentioned the kind of absent presence of whiteness. And I think there's a similar absent presence of queerness in the film. I was not really sure how to interpret Trula either. I appreciate I think in a way, I think the decision to not make Trula less opaque is intentional, and I appreciate that. I think it would be a different film, or it would give us a different set of things to hold on to with, just like a literal representation of a queer partnership between Trula and Yellow Mary if that had been explored. But I think in not making that an explicit dynamic, but giving us hints of it. So there's hints in the sense of we see them touch each other's waist when they are, I think, like standing at a riverbank or near the beach. I think in the way that Yellow Mary's, sisters or family members kind of, there's some shade. I mean, it's more direct than shade. They're talking badly about them. And we're not sure if that's because of the queerness. We're not sure if that's just because Yellow Mary has been off on the mainland. There's disdain there that's felt, but that isn't directly explained. And so I don't have a definitive answer, but I do think there's a lot to be mined there, both for kind of pulling out what those traces suggest and in thinking about, what are the stakes of giving us those traces, but not making it any more explicit than it is.
I mean, I loved watching the exploration of judgment within a family and what's regarded as okay and what isn't. And so for me, Yellow Mary's character, one, the fact that she's Yellow Mary, I mean, it's just, there's something really fascinating to talk about, like colorism and the way that plays into the dynamics of this family, but also sexuality and the judgment that comes with exploring sexuality in a certain form, but also the idea of being ruined. And what does that mean in this community, and how are you going to be regarded after being ruined? And I love at the end of the film, I hate that I am losing the character's name, but the woman who was essentially pregnant with the unborn child, hey guys, am I ruined? Is this how you're going to talk about me? It's like, it really is, the women of this family are fighting for the way we're going to treat each other moving forward, right? The way we're going to regard each other moving forward, and how, what that fight might look like. And so seeing her character, seeing her partner, she represented for me a new direction in which the women of this family are going, and a new sense of like decisions, right? Making decisions that my family doesn't condone, but I feel is the next best step for me in my own personal journey. So it felt like this conflict of personal journey and family identity, and who's right and who's wrong. And I don't think we answer it. I don't think we need to answer the question, but you can see Julie Dash like presenting that for us, and we're kind of exploring what that looks like.
And to Alexandria, I mean, I really enjoyed your comments about place. And I think about the film also as a migration tale. And so I wonder, and it's sort of an open question that I have, how much a character like Trula is representing mainlandness, or, not being rooted in the place, right? And how does that sort of play into, help to otherize her in some ways, and Yellow Mary's connection to her. So that's also another element to sort of meditate about.
And I think within that, it's interesting that, we kind of see I think a conversation about color and colorism could be a full hour itself, but there is a kind of reversal of, we have a family of dark-skinned people and this lighter skinned woman is not the unquestioned most desirable figure. She's actually being otherized through her, and not to say that she's being oppressed, but her being lighter does not automatically make her the most desirable. And I think even that in itself, just in the visual politics of the film, is very significant for 1991. It would be today as well.
Thank you. So we have a question in the chat from Mara Keir. She says, the visuals of Daughters of the Dust are so stunning that they often dominate the discussion. But I believe that Daughters of the Dust is one of the greatest food movies ever filmed. I would love to hear people's thoughts about Dash's portrayal of Sea Island foodways.
I'm obsessed. I was rewatching this film and I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize the role food played in the film up to this point. Maybe I was just watching it as an audience member, but trying to watch it from a real critical eye. I mean, talk about a film that's actively showing a piece of culture that we just hadn't seen in cinema in any like mainstream way. Watching them cook fresh fish, fresh crab on the sand, on the beach. I mean, I felt so I felt invited to the cookout. I felt like I was sitting right, the way she shoots it, it feels like you're right there and you're part of the experience. And it's this where I'm not teaching you the culture, I'm not teaching you anything. I'm just I'm laying it out for you to absorb and participate in whichever way feels best, if that makes sense. Sorry if that didn't come out as eloquent as I hoped, but it really was. It was this visceral experience, it was just beautiful.
And there's also like a nod to, to deeper histories on those plates, like rice. You get a lot of representations visually of plantation work around indigo, but rice and rice production, its African roots, the ways that it comes and saves colonies like South Carolina, Black women's production of rice, Black people's knowledge of how to make rice becoming a staple in the diets of the people in the region. You don't get all of that in the film, but it's on the plate. And what's on the plate is different than maybe what you might find in some other Southern locale. So place, again, Alexandria, is on the plate. And it's not just sort of where we are in the film, it's reflected on the plate in a way. So I did find that interesting.
And I don't know much about, or I don't know anything actually about Gullah foodways, but I think the portrayal of these ritual acts of cooking resonates for me with those scenes of cooking and of food preparation in Beyonce's Lemonade, where I think in both of these films, even though Daughters of the Dust, there's a more direct sort of family environment, whereas in Lemonade, we're mostly seeing these women doing food preparation and eating just with themselves. I like Winter's framing of we're sort of invited in to watch and to understand this cooking as a way that these women are taking care of each other. And that, of course, it is still labor, like it's household, it's domestic labor, but we can also see it as something that is a way that they manifest love and create their own kind of community and togetherness through that food preparation. And I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. We have a hand up from Sylvia. Sylvia, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you all so much. This has been really great. Winter, I was wondering if I could ask you, I know Beyonce borrowed from the film, and I was wondering if you could speak of how that actually changes the reception of the film or the legacy of the film.
Yeah, well, the film was re-released, right? Like not too long after the premiere of Lemonade. So I think I can't speak to it fully, but for me, it felt like a very mainstream pop icon, right? Beyonce is drawing inspiration from a film that in some ways is still not very mainstream, right? Like today, I know several people who haven't seen the film unless they're specifically interested in Black cinema or Black women as filmmakers, right? So having someone like Beyonce draw inspiration, the visual of the film, which is so rich and just iconic, it just brought a bigger spotlight back to the film in some ways and reminded us, hey, this film is still inspiring us all. This film is still a part of the conversation. You maybe just forgot that it was a part of the conversation. So Beyonce just brought it back to our focus. And I think a lot of people experienced the film for the first time because they knew Beyonce drew inspiration from it.
Dr. Cooper, Alexandria, do you have anything else you want to add about the role that lemonade has played in the story of this film?
I love Alexandria. Nope.
That's fine.
Yeah, Winter, you covered it.
We're approaching the end of our hour, so I'll just ask the one question that one more question from the chat. So we have from Petra. Is it possible to think of the Daughters of the Dust within the context of Afrofuturism? She says, I know the term is a neologism, coined only a couple of years later, but the way the film treats time and constructing of futures might suggest so, ...
Well, I definitely agree that there's a conscious invocation of time, the unborn child being connected both to the ancestral past and is representing the uncertain future, the whole sort of migration. So, the central tension in the film and the story is what will happen when the family leaves, the island, going off into the mainland, into some unwritten future. What is that going to be? So a lot of what's happening in the film is, sort of grappling with the unknowns around and imagining and projecting dreams and hopes and healing into a time that has not yet come. So, I mean, that's what I think of when I, grapple with how might this fit in a frame of, Afrofuture imaginings in time.
Yeah. And I think, continuing on that, I go back to one of the quotes I included in the sort of introductory comments of the ancestors and the womb are one and the same. And yeah, I'm not sure that I suppose that is the way that I would think about it in conversation with Afrofuturist text, is in recognizing that the future is not just tied to the past, but that that there's ways that in order to understand the future or to imagine futures, it also requires, especially for Black diasporic subjects, a different kind of encounter with the past, and one that is actually embodied.
Yeah, what they said, that was great.
Okay, we'll finish. Shasta has her hand up. We'll make that our last question.
Hi, I know I came into the chat a little late. I don't really have any questions. I just wanted to share my personal experience with the film and how it was just so powerful and relatable to my own life specifically. Like, it was so crazy that all of the things that they were talking about experiencing, I have experienced in the recent time. My grandmother raised me, and I live in an apartment where she lived. She actually passed away in the room that I live in right now. And just everything that was going on, even with Yellow Mary being queer and expressing her queerness, I feel like I went through the same thing. And I just want to say that it was very touching. And I'm thankful to have been here and to experience that. And that's all I wanted to say.
Shasta, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you for your heart. and thank you for your vulnerability. And I think, and I'm sorry, Alexandra, I completely cut you off. I'm
No,
so
no,
sorry.
I was just gonna say thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what you're feeling and that connection today to what the film is presenting is exactly what makes it so powerful, right? It's like, I think everyone can watch this film in a different season of their life and take different things from it and see new things and see a new perspective of their family and the way they think about their own past and how that past is with them in their present and they're currently walking with it into their future. So I just wanted to say, thank you for that. And I think there are many people who are having reactions similar to yours based off their own specifics of their own life. I know for me, I'm looking at my grandmother and thinking, hey, I need to really actively learn about where you come from, because I have a rich family history that I maybe haven't tapped into, because as a child, you don't think that you need to, but that history and where you come from is quite literally going to define where you go. And I'm thank you for just sharing. I felt really inspired by your comments.
You're welcome. And the last thing that my grandmother said to me, the last coherent conversation that I had with her, she just was yelling at me profusely, think of your future, think about your future, and just how I saw the family having to leave the grandmother and going on to a new life. But, Yellow Mary stayed behind, and the other woman that was pregnant stayed behind, and she was able to see new life be given before she passed. And that was amazing.
Exactly. I love that.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really powerful note to end on, unless Alexandria or Dr. Cooper have anything they want to add.
I just want to thank you all so much for hosting this, and thank you everyone for attending, and thank you for sharing your responses and reactions to the film.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm sure everyone would, if we were in person, would join me in a round of applause, but we can't do that. So I'll just say on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much to our three speakers, Dr. Melissa Cooper, Alexandria Smith, and Winter Dunn, for a really, really powerful and moving discussion. Thank you all so much. We will end it there.